Think, feel, do. Presentations that change behaviour. So the agenda today, it's kind of lopsided. It's mostly one words. Why, do, think, feel. And then how do we link storytelling and think, feel, do together? So I'm going to start with a very simple example and one that I've used before. It's from a fantastic book by Chip and Dan Heath, Made to Stick. We're coming up to Christmas, so if you're looking for a book to read and you haven't read this one before, it's a great read. It's an easy read. It's a lot of fun and it's very useful. And one of the stories they tell in there is about this study back in the 1990s, and it looked into the fat content, the saturated fat content of a medium-sized bag of movie popcorn. And what they discovered was that each bag had 37 grams of saturated fat in it. And the recommended dose, the recommended amount of fats you're supposed to eat is about 20 grams. So how are they going to get this information across? Because clearly people are eating too much of this saturated fat. And what they did, rather than talk about the data, they showed this picture. They said a fried breakfast, a Big Mac lunch, steak dinner, that's 37 grams of fat. That's the same as one bag of movie popcorn. That was a really powerful message. It was much better than the data. It was much better than the objective information. And it resulted in several people, in lots of people, trading down and eating less popcorn. Wasn't very good for the popcorn industry, of course. But that was at a much more emotional level. And we're going to see why that was happening in this presentation today. It comes down to behavioral economics. And what better place to start than Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He looks at lots and lots of examples, as does Dan Ariely. And here's one of those. Which would you pick, an 80% chance of survival or a 20% chance of death? Now, a large part of the audience today are going to be statistically minded. We know that they're the same. But actually, A is picked twice as often as B. The feel that that is a better option drives the do. We don't sit there and look at the exact numbers. We have an emotional feeling that 80% chance of survival is a better thing than a 20% chance of death. So the do is determined by the feel. Most things we do are decided at the emotional level. So we need to make sure that that is right in our presentations. So there are a couple of metaphors, or one set of metaphors, that are used to describe the way the brain works, and that's system 1 and system 2. System 1 is all about heuristics. It's very fast. It's usually right. It does more than 90% of all of our decisions. When we drive a car, if we're used to driving a car, we drive with system 1. When we choose a toothpaste in less than 1 second when faced with 160 choices, that is system 1. If I ask you to calculate 2 plus 2, you know it is 4 without doing any math. That is system 1. System 2, by contrast, is the thinking process. When we talk about thinking, we sort of mean system 2. It is slow. It's energy sapping. If you have to do a lot of it, you feel very tired. We only use it when it's necessary. So if we're buying a fridge or a freezer, we actually do look at a lot of information. How much can we afford? How big is it? We'll get the tape measure out to see how many centimeters or inches wide it is. If we're driving a car and we're only just learning, it's really system 2. Can you remember when you were learning how to drive a car? You were focusing, you're trying to think, feet do this, my left hand does this, my right hand does this, I'm looking at this, I'm keeping the revs at this level. It was really intense and it was very tiring. If I asked you to calculate 4 times 17 times 6, the chances are you simply won't do it. That's system 1. But if you do it, you are going to be using system 2 to apply a strategy and a process for calculating the answer. And a lot of people use the metaphor of the elephant and the rider. Chip and Dan Heath certainly do in their follow-up book to make it stick. And system one is like the elephant. It does all the hard work. It gets us where we need to be, but it doesn't have a lot of thinking ability. And system two is like the rider. The rider can make the elephant do most things, not everything, but he can make the elephant do most things, but it takes a lot of effort. And as soon as he stops doing it, the elephant goes back to what it was doing before. And that is the situation that we are in with most decisions. Now, how does that relate to changing behavior? Now, it doesn't matter whether it's nudge, whether it's government, whether it's marketers, or whether it's us writing a presentation, we should be thinking about how we're going to change behavior. And we can link this rider and elephant model to that process. We have to inform the rider. So when they do actually think about it, it makes sense. When they check the facts, it makes sense. We've got to motivate the elephant. The elephant has got to want to move in the right direction. And we need to shape the path so that it's easier to do the right thing, the thing we want people to do, than to do anything else. So inform the rider, that's the think part of it. We've got to motivate the elephant, that's the feel part of it. And we've got to shape the path in terms of the do that we want to happen. So let's have a little bit of a quiz. When we're designing a study, should we start with A, the business question being addressed, B, the data, or C, the actions we want to cause? Okay, well, hopefully you all think the business question being addressed. It would be really quite intellectually bankrupt if we started designing the study in terms of what we wanted the results to be. We see it happening, but we don't approve of it. And it would be very methodologically biased if we said, well, here's the data, now what question should we be asking? When we're finding the story in the data, should we start with 1, the business question being addressed, 2, the data, or 3, the actions we want to cause? Okay, again, we start with the question that is being addressed. Yes, we're going to work with the data. We're hoping to find the actions out. But we don't want to start with the actions. We want to start with addressing the business question. And here's the final one of these questions. When designing the presentation, should we start with 1, the business question being addressed, 2, the data, or 3, the actions we want to cause? The answer is 3, but I frequently see junior market researchers start off with the data. They will start off with the questionnaire and they will present that presentation almost exactly in questionnaire order. Slightly better, we will see some people start with the business question and they will say, well, here is the business question and here are the recommendations and here is how we got from one to the other. But actually, when you're designing the presentation, your starting point is, what do I want the audience to do afterwards? And if you don't know that, you can't really design the presentation. You can't write the presentation. You can't deliver the presentation. You have to know what it is the audience should do afterwards, in your opinion. What is it that you want to encourage? So what sorts of things do we mean by do? Maybe we're going to say, do launch the product. Maybe we're going to say, choose option A. We might find that we're going to try to encourage the client to cause them to address customer dissatisfaction with check-in and catering. We might think that the best to do is for them to do more research, because actually what we have found is that there is a problem, but the remedy is inconclusive from the data we've collected. We think the client should do more research. That is the do. Sometimes the do is cancel the project. We've tested it and we think this idea is a real lemon. What you should do is stop. Or, and this is equally a do, carry on doing exactly what you are doing. That is also a do. So maybe the client has come to you and they're a little bit nervous about their current plans. You need to go back. If the right recommendation is keep doing exactly what you are doing, that is the do. So the do will change all the time. It will be based on the business question. It will be based on what you found in the information. But you need to be clear about what that do is. So how do we find the do? Well, we can have a bit of a lopsided Venn diagram. We've got the business question. What is it the business needs to know? We've got the data we collected, and we've got analysis. And we've got the business context. What else is happening? What have they tried in the past? What can they afford? What do the laws allow? And at the intersection of these three, we have the place the do will be. It encompasses the business question, the data and analysis, and the business context. If it's just the business context and the business question, then market research wasn't needed. And of course, in many situations, this is absolutely true. We have a business question, but we also know the remedies, we have the information, maybe there's legislation covering what we have to do anyway. Market research is not needed. Maybe we're in this sector over here. We've done the data and the analysis, we've got the business question, we've come up with a wonderful answer, but if it doesn't match the business context, it's not viable. So in many countries in the world, cigarette advertising on the TV is illegal. We may find out from the business question, the data analysis, that that would be the right recommendation, but it's not viable, so we don't recommend it. We might say, make the product cheaper, but that may not be viable. Make the product longer lasting, but that may not be viable. That's why we need the business context when we're producing the do. And we have this tiny little box up here as well. We've got the business context, we've got the data analysis, but it doesn't address the business question. It's irrelevant. It may become relevant some other time, but that sector up there is irrelevant. So the do is the place where these three circles overlap and all three parts come into play. So some tips about the do. You've got to ask a lot of questions, not just to customers, but to clients, and as many different people within the client organization as possible. Assess what has been done in the past, because that's going to give you a lot of that context from that Venn diagram we've just looked at. Assess what the client is already thinking of, because you're going to recommend yes, do it, or no, don't do it. And to do that, you need to understand. Test your ideas. So go back to your internal client and beyond that to further clients and say, looks to me like you should be doing this. Does that make sense to you? And they may say, yeah, absolutely. We've been thinking of doing that. Or no, we can't do that because actually the lifespan of the product is only 2 months. And if we do that plan, we would need a 3-month-long product. So test your ideas, go back and voice them, but do it in strong terms so the client knows what you're recommending. And then once you've got the do, you're going to link it to the feel and the think. So let's have a think about the think for a moment. Changing behavior. We're going to inform the rider. As researchers, our recommendations are based on evidence. It's one of the core things that we believe. When people check the facts are right, they are right. It's one of the core things that we value ourselves. It's why we are brought in. We are brought into decision making because we are relatively objective in terms of the internal politics. We bring evidence and we test evidence. The evidence justifies the storytelling and it justifies the emotional techniques we use to convince the actions. Typically, we will go through a process of looking at the data, looking at the business question and the context, identify strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So that's looking at our data. And then we try to create the do by saying, well, can we match strengths to opportunities? Or can we convert weaknesses to strengths? Or can we convert threats to opportunities? These are all elements which are based on reasoning, they're based on evidence, they're based on information. These are the think that when somebody goes back and they look at our recommendation, they see that it's a house built with really good foundations. I love this logo from the Market Research Society in the UK, Evidence Matters, because the reason we are involved in this decision-making process is that we are great at the think. We haven't always been great at the feel. We haven't always been great at the do. But the think is our core strength, and we want to make sure that it stays absolutely central to what we do. But we're going to convince people with the feel, not the think. If we go back to this image here, we could have shown people all day long data about 37 grams and 20 grams, but it was 3 junk meals that really made the difference. Think, feel, do. Think popcorn has saturated fat. Saturated fat is not good. There are limits. All very rational things. People can go and back check us and it will all stand up. Feel 3 junk meals in one day is dumb gross. I don't have to tell you how many grams of fat 3 junk meals in one day is. You know you shouldn't be eating 3 junk meals in one day. Do. What the people who produced this study and the people who produced that campaign wanted to do was, when you're about to buy movie popcorn, think about all that fat, feel a bit sick or feel a bit scared, trade down or trade out, buy something else instead. So this is the think, feel, do model. Think, facts, they're the platform we're building things on. Feel, people very rarely change their beliefs or behavior because of the facts. Change happens at the emotional level. If we look at what's going on in the UK at the moment, the way people think about Brexit is almost nothing to do with facts. If you are a Remainer and a newspaper comes out with some facts that you disagree with, you challenge them, you don't like them, or you dismiss them. If we look at the situation in North America, if you are pro-Trump, pro-President Trump, and some negative facts come out, you call them fake information. You dismiss them. We don't change our opinion based on facts. It has to be something which resonates at the emotional level. And do, whenever you make a presentation, you should be clear in your mind. What outcome are you trying to create? What is the action that you, the teller, wants the audience to do afterwards? It's essential that you get that clear in your mind. Once we've got that, how do we deliver it? That's where storytelling comes in. We know what the think is. We know that we have to use emotions, and we know that we have a clear do. And how we use emotions is part of the storytelling process. So we find the do. What is the do we want to achieve? What think is needed? And we're going to remove everything that's unnecessary. So we've got lots of facts, lots of information, but we only want the ones that are actually necessary for that do. And then we have to develop the feel. That's the story that links the think to the do. So if we look at what was going on in this movie popcorn case, let's think about what was left out. Other things in popcorn. There was data about the salt and the sugar. It wasn't reported in that presentation. What about a larger batch of popcorn? They would have had the data on that, but it wasn't reported because it didn't add to the story. Giving you 2 pieces of evidence is no better than 1 piece. It's the feel that changes things. There are other things that are eaten in movie theaters, ice creams, chocolates, all of those have problems. But if we have too many strands, we lose the emotional impact of talking about movie popcorn. Other comparators we could have compared with a normal meal. So this is probably twice as bad as 3 regular meals, but it doesn't help. Once you've got a simple message, stick with it. One of the things I'm really keen on promoting is what I call robust simplification. If you simplify the story, does it become just as strong? So movie popcorn data, about double your daily fat allowance. The visual story, a day's worth of unhealthy food. That is what I call robust simplification. When somebody else tells the story to their friend, their neighbor, their colleague at work, the same impact carries through. So how might we use images to develop emotion. Here's a lovely example. We can tell people about, here are the facts, here are the number of people that did not follow the rules. But if we can show a picture which really highlights it, that makes intuitive sense. Now I feel like that's true. I feel like it's true because it's simple, I've experienced it, and I can see that it's the result of lots of people to make that brown muddy mark. Here's another situation where you've got some words, but you want to make that picture bring it alive. So many insights arrive from the unexpected. Look for the unexpected. That was the message that I wanted to convey. But for me and the audiences I've tested this with, this image, all right, looking behind the curtain. I frequently want to talk about looking for the contradictions when you're finding the story, and this particular one about Heinz ketchup works really well. I can describe it in words. It does not have the impact. It doesn't have the same impact if we don't show the Heinz glass bottle upside down, which is how people discovered it. It's how the ethnographers saw it in people's cupboards that led to the outcome. So these sorts of images which make the story simpler, which make the story clearer, which show that this is something that is happening in the real world, all help you get the information across at the emotional level. What about video? Well, what I've discovered is very sad for a quantitative researcher. On the one hand, maybe you've got 1,000 customer satisfaction interviews and they show a dip in the Net Promoter Score. And that has a certain amount of weight, but one video of one angry customer has much more weight. Now, the combination of think and feel here is that the think tells me as a researcher that there is a real problem with the Net Promoter Score. But I don't rest my presentation on that data. I find a really useful video that represents the emotional context for the think data. And it's the emotional context of a really angry customer that is going to make the difference. With words, there are various things we can do, but maybe we do some sentiment analysis along with that Net Promoter Score, and the score for Northern Rail was minus 20%. What we can do again is we can pull out a verbatim and we say, well, 10% of the statements were a bit like, great help from train staff this morning when my bag broke. But 3 times as many, and the font is 3 times as big, train was dirty, late, and the Wi-Fi didn't work. So let's make these things much more emotional, convey the weight of what we want to do. We might use a chart like the chart on the left when we're finding the data, but it's not very emotional. This is one from Seth Godin, which really clearly says coal has associated with a much higher death per watts produced than nuclear. He hasn't put the numbers on there because actually the numbers don't matter. You can see how big the difference is. That is what happens when you do charts and infographics that work at the emotional level. So what are the key factors for storytelling and working with think, feel, do? You've got to know what the do is. You're not just trying to find the best story. You're trying to find the story that uses emotion to link the think, what you believe the facts to be, to the outcome, the do that you're trying to create. You've got to look and see what think and feel are available to you. You've got to think about who is the audience, the format. Is it face-to-face? Is it a written report? That will change how you do these things. And is it good news or bad news you're trying to convey? Good news and bad news. There are typically 4 stories. The good news with some caveats, bad news with some options, and just bad news. The storytelling for these 4 cases is different. The really easy one is good news. You almost don't need to do anything beyond, great, you've done a wonderful job, everything's super, proceed to the next stage. You'll find very few people are challenging you over that. The opposite side of that is bad news, where people will fight you every step of the way. So you need your best tools to convince people. And of course, it's defined by what the client wanted and what the research finds. And occasionally I've done a piece of research and we've gone back to the client and said, well, actually the concept wasn't very good. And it turned out to be good news because they didn't want to launch it. Or it turns out to be good news because although it wasn't very good, they thought it was going to be awful. So you really need to understand the context if you're going to do a good job of delivering the right sort of presentation. In bad news, I like to think about the 5 stages of grief: anger, denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance. So you go back and you say, this product's a really bad idea, and they're just angry with you. And then they deny it and they say, no, I think you need to redo that data, or you had the wrong sample. And then there's bargaining. Well, okay, it's not very good for heavy users, but maybe light users would like it. And then we run through the depression and acceptance. It's really unusual that one presentation or one report will tackle all these stages of grief and bad news in one go. You are normally going to have a pre-meeting, then have the meeting, and then have some follow-ups in order to do that job properly. Facts are really enough to persuade people. Emotions are the key. Customer video can be more powerful than any amount of analysis. And here is something that I do find is useful. Go back to a point where the data and your findings and the client's expectations all match, and then move forward from there. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment from Hans Rosling. Then you've got to create that narrative flow, and it wants to be very simple: the beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's going to be linear, no looping back, no red herrings, no dead ends. Use all those storytelling devices, the humor, the personal anecdotes, the interaction, and ensure the audience are on the same path. Now that means putting in some redundancy, some interaction, and some summaries. And we're going to see some of those in the examples. So 4 very quick examples, and then we'll be ready for Q&A. Now the first is an inconvenient truth, which Al Gore turned from a set of slides, a PowerPoint presentation, into a movie, into a Nobel Prize, and into an Oscar. It's had an immense impact on the world. All the countries in the world, bar one, are signed up now to reducing global emissions. 99.9% of all relevant scientists are committed to a model that recognizes climate change. We are seeing initiatives, for example, in China. A friend was telling me recently, he lives there. If you want a petrol motor car, you have to pay a £15,000 license registration fee. An electric car is free. We are going to see an enormous low emissions, low damage, high electricity economy in places like China going forward. So the do was very clear in what Al Gore was trying to do. He also used humor, some clever storytelling, and a lot of emotional elements. And I'm going to remind those of you who've seen the movie of this one. He's showing a chart about CO2 and temperature. And when he gets to the current time, he has to get on this elevator that lifts him up into the air so he can point to the final piece. That is the sort of emotional step that says, wow, this is a really different number. And he personalized a lot of the story, and he showed places from around the world. So that was a very effective use of think for the data and then feel, achieving a do. My second example isn't a presentation, it's a campaign. This is from Intermarché in France, and I must apologize for my accent. Les fruits et légumes moches, the ugly fruits or the inglorious fruits and vegetables. And the background to this is that French consumers have been shifting towards only buying perfect fruit and veg. As a result, thousands of tons of food were being wasted in production and in stores and at home. And so there was a very clear desire from this information that what the do was we need to do is boost the purchase and use of imperfect fruit and veg. And this was launched in 2013 by Intermarché in France and has been amazingly successful. So what did they do? Advertising campaign to tackle the problem head on. and making the search for perfection ridiculous. So they were trying to create an emotional feeling that searching perfection was ridiculous. Changing the purchase processing, which is a think related thing, point of sale activities, which is about shaping the path, and a price reduction, which is about shaping the path and think and emotion. And they had elements like this: the ugly carrot in a soup, who cares how ugly the carrot was? The grotesque apple keeps the doctor away. The ridiculous potato elected Miss Mashed Potato 2014. In a mashed potato, it really doesn't matter how ugly that original vegetable was. They then linked that together with the 5-a-day campaign, which is all about think. In the stores, they bought the products that the farmers usually throw away. They gave them their own place in the store, which is about shaping the path. Special mention in the sales receipts, that's about shaping the path. The 30% price reduction, that is think, feel, and do, and shaping the path. They did trial soup and juice, and they said to people, okay, this juice is made from ugly oranges. This soup is made from ugly vegetables. An immense number given away, led to 24% more people visiting the store, lots of social media conversations, achieving a great outcome from a very clear think, feel, do approach. Inform the driver. That's the thing. 5 portions a day of fruit is necessary, but it can be expensive. Motivate the elephant. Make fun of perfection. Get people to taste the soup and the juice. Offer price reductions. And then shape the path. Special locations in the store. Point of sale activities. Reminding people via the receipt. Now, this was brought to my attention by one of my clients in pharmaceuticals. I do a lot of research in pharmaceuticals, so thank you very much, Ferreira, for highlighting this. This is a thing called the Universal Patient Language. And it was developed by Bristol Myers Squibb, but it's now open source. You can use it, and it's got some fantastic ideas for simplifying messages and making them more emotional. So traditional communication for immuno-oncology would look something like this. Over the heads of most people, especially if they're worried. But instead, the UPL looked at things like this. Okay, the healthy body is like this, but here are some cancer cells. So we've got flowers and we've got weeds. Now, let's have a look at what happens when we use chemotherapy. We spread killer onto the good stuff and the bad stuff. That is why you feel sick, because we have not just killed the weeds, we've also killed some of the flowers. What about surgery? Well, when we do surgery, we dig out some of the flowers as well as the weeds. And we don't always get all of the weeds. So this is a much clearer way and a much more emotionally understanding way of conveying this information. Probably the best presenter of complex information was Hans Rosling, who passed away earlier this year. And this is a great presentation. There's probably about 10 of his presentations on TED if you go and look for them and on the video. If you type in TED, religion and babies, you'll get to this video. And this is a very interesting case because he presented this in Qatar to quite a traditional audience. So he's got an audience that isn't going to necessarily accept what he's got to say. And he starts off by asking a quiz. So if we want to be sure that our audience is thinking as well as feeling, putting a quiz into that process near the beginning. And here he was asking them, in 2100, how many babies a year do they think are going to be born? Is it the current figure of 2 billion? Was it going to drop to 1 billion, go up to 3 billion? Would it carry on the line it's on at the moment to 4 billion? And so the audience had a think and they made a guess. And then he took the audience back to 1960, because in 1960, the world fitted most of their prejudice. The only countries with low numbers of babies per woman were Catholic countries, the countries in blue, plus Japan. Japan was seen as an outlier. So we see this really big difference. And this was the origin, perhaps, of maybe there are some religions that make it difficult. Catholicism, Islam, whatever, Hindu, make it difficult to bring down the number of babies per woman. But then he used time data, and I've jumped ahead a long way here, and he showed what the picture was like in 2010. And all of the countries with the Eastern religions, and 80% of all countries in the world now have 1, 2, or 3 babies per woman. The world has changed. There are still some countries with a higher birth rate, but they're a mixture of Islam and Christianity. And for every one of those, you can show matching countries at the bottom end of the table. 1, this change has already happened. 2, religion is irrelevant. And he has taken the audience on a journey, something they might not have been willing to believe at the beginning, but by the end of it, they have discovered it for themselves. And then he goes on to show with a wonderful animation, and please go and have a look at this video, about why the population, which is about 7 billion today, is going to increase to 10 billion. Those people have already been born. The number of children is not growing. We cannot stop this by reducing the number of babies born unless we go down to 1 baby per woman. If we go down to a level of that China did in the 1 baby policy, then we could make a slight difference to this. We might only reach 9 billion population. Because the do that Hans Rosling wanted, well, he had 2 do's. The first is stop thinking about the world today based on the world yesterday. And this is a point he makes in a lot of his videos. And the second is, if you are involved in planning for the future, you have to plan for a population of 10 billion people. That is a really big do, and he makes that case incredibly well in this presentation, so I strongly recommend that you have a look at it. Have you ever had the experience where you do a presentation and it's gone really well and the client's been nodding their heads, and then at the end they go, "Oh, I already knew that"? If you do a great job on feel, you will often hear, "Oh, I already knew that." It's a mark of success. Don't worry when it happens. It means you've done your job properly. You communicated your idea so well that the recipient feels it's right. And when they feel it's right, they feel they already knew it. So this is actually a target that you're looking for. When it feels right, it's more likely to be acted on, especially if you shape the path. So you show what the first steps are. You've done some work with the people who might create the implementation. So just a few tips from that. Start by identifying the do. Don't start by doing some storytelling. Don't start by writing a presentation. Decide what it is that you need to recommend. Check the do in advance, because your first ideas will normally need refining, correcting, fixing, because you're going to be wide of the mark. You're going to suggest something that's been tried before. You're going to suggest something which is technically not possible. So get through that process so you start recommending something that is practical, which hasn't been tried before, which has some evidence to support it. You're going to base your do on think, but you're going to create the story using feel. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, Ray. Thank you so much for that. And dare I say, I already knew that. Mark of a good presentation. Really, really interesting. But, you know, I suppose once you start pointing them out as you did, it becomes really obvious. And I think that's what you meant by the, "Oh, I already knew that" effect.
Absolutely.
So no questions in just yet, but anybody who's listening, if you've got a question for Ray, please do tweet it with the hashtag NewMR or put it in the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel. But to get things going, Ray, I have a couple of questions for you. So a lot of what you're talking about is behavioral economics, storytelling, context, user experience, a lot of marketing as well. And as market researchers, these are not areas inherently that we are going to have skills in. So what recommendations would you make for all market researchers, veteran or newbie, who are looking at doing more presentations, doing more client-facing or presentations at conferences, what kind of skills do you think that they could do with undertaking things to learn, workshops, webinars, things like that?
Okay, I'll start with a slightly different question, which is what should companies do? And they should probably recruit some additional people. So market researchers should get better at this, but actually bringing in designers, usability people, storytellers, movie graphers, people who tell stories in different ways, that will help with the mix. But what about the individuals? Well, you need to, from wherever you are, move in the right direction. So if you're already quite a long way down this route, and you're quite a good presenter, then you might want to start doing some masterclasses, or you might want to start doing some movie training, so that you get even better at those skills. Improv. I'm amazed at the number of people in the last few years who've started going to improv because they see that as delivering benefits. Or try your hand at stand-up comedy. It's great for developing pacing, for developing resistance and a thick skin, and various other things like that. Look at great presenters and say, why are they great presenters? So I think probably the most important thing is to become a lot more reflexive and say, what happens when that person makes a presentation? Why do the audience respond in that way? What techniques are they doing in terms of storytelling, humor, body language? What is it they've done with their message that makes it so relevant? I want to look around for people whose, when they make a recommendation, something happens. I'm going to look at what they are doing. And then I'm going to ask other people to help me and look at what I do and say, how should I change it? How should I become more effective? You don't want to know how should I become more like A or more like B, because that may not be right. You want to know how you should become more effective, and you need to listen to other people in order to get that advice.
So key themes there, Ray, I think what you're saying is hire the experts, certainly make them part of your team, the designers, the storytellers, the designers, the storytellers, even filmmakers, these sorts of people, but also upskill yourself.
Yes.
And your team. Okay, great. The other question I had for you, Ray, is a bit more about who you're presenting to. So of course we should do, as you say, great advice about making more almost a kind of emotional comparison, so that the thing earlier about junk food, and knowing that your audience inherently know that 3 junk meals a day are bad for you, but that requires initial research to know that your audience will get those examples and sort of cultural context and things like that. So what recommendations would you make for a speaker who is either presenting insights to a very different audience than maybe the audience of the research participants, or to a mixed audience who are from very different cultural backgrounds and ethnicities, and who might not necessarily get certain comparisons you might make in presentations? What recommendations would you make there?
Well, again, I'm going to expand it slightly. So there are 2 types of mixed audiences. But there are probably many types, but 2. So we'll come back to that. So where your audience is relatively homogenous, you need to make sure that you understand them. You've done some work around. So if you've never presented in pharma, then you are going to struggle initially. You need to be a little bit of a sector expert. If you've never presented in employee research circles, you've got a room full of HR professionals, you are going to struggle to know what are the common terms and references within that. So attending other people's presentations is probably one of the first steps you can do in terms of building up that skill set. You want to hear as many other people present as possible. One of the things that always amazes me is if a client has a presenter workshop day where they invite in 4 or 5 different agencies, they all present on something, it's quite often some agencies will only stay for their own presentation, even though they've been invited to stay the whole day through. Yeah, I would kill to hear more agencies present. I would kill to, metaphorically, to hear more insight managers present internally, because that is the best way of seeing what they're doing and then talking to the audience to see whether it worked. Some of it you can gather by looking at the audience. Then the next category is mixed. So you're presenting to a client and you have got managers of different functions present and the insight manager and maybe somebody from finance. And that is going to be really difficult to keep everybody motivated. And what are the do's? So you're going to need to try to do different things. Ideally, volunteer and say, you know what? We're booked in to do a 1-hour presentation and you've got 6 different groups coming. How about I do 5 half-hour presentations, but we get the right group of people in for each of them? And some clients will say, yeah, well, if you're willing to do that, because I will do it. It's a bigger time commitment, but I would rather do that so that I could tailor it to the audiences in a much sharper way than trying to have something that covers everybody, because it's going to be a compromise if it covers lots of different things. Then we have another type of mixed group, which is you're presenting to an international audience. So it could be for an international client and they've brought people together from lots of different countries, or it could be at an international conference. It's probably going to be in English if you're listening to this, and most international presentations are in English. Make sure that English is international English, not British English, not Australian English, not South African English, not regional US English, but actually the version that is relatively common. Try your material out on local audiences. So I was once presenting in Shanghai to a group of people, one of whom was a Westerner, the rest of them were Vietnamese and Chinese. And I was talking about how you convey numbers. And I was coming up to the next slide, and I knew it was coming. And it's really effective in the West, which is over 90% of Jesus's disciples did not betray him. Because, of course, the point of that story is that 1 disciple out of 12 did betray him, and the percentages are irrelevant. So this was an example of when you wouldn't trust percentages and where you really want to look at numbers. And just before I used the slide, I said, how many people in this room have heard of Jesus Christ? And about 3/4 of the hands went up. And then I said, how many have heard of the disciples? And we were down to maybe 10% in the people in the room. So that story was not going to fly. And I pulled that and we didn't run with it. And you need to get some self-reflection and self-introspection. Okay, that is a story that only works in this culture. And you need to get people from other cultures and other backgrounds listening to your material and making suggestions. But there is one tip that I would certainly offer, which is stay away from sporting analogies. One is they tend to be a little biased, sexist towards men, but they are really not understood. So if I'm presenting in the UK and it's only Australians and British people in the room, I might talk about playing a straight bat. It's a really powerful metaphor. It's meaningless to an awful lot of people. So it's finding those sort of things and then talking about things finding analogies which are understood, things which are in popular culture. And if you're over 50, make sure that you're not talking about things that happened before your audience was born. So talking about classic black and white movies, John Wayne or something like this, or Humphrey Bogart, no, it's not going to help the clarity of what you're saying.
Right, okay. Very true. So keep it relevant to your audience. Always do some practice beforehand, which is a recommendation, I suppose, anyway, but particularly if you have a mixed group of people from various backgrounds, doing a practice first. And I suppose it's the same for comedians. What's funny in one country or with one type of audience might not be very funny at all, and just sort of go a bit flat with another audience. So really good advice there. Another question, Ray, while we're maybe still waiting for people to get a question or two in, is around. Sorry, I just wrote some notes here. It's around this storytelling and the journey, because you mentioned talking to your audience, so talking about a journey. Would you happen to know where people can pick up some really good skills in storytelling? Are there any techniques that you use particularly, or resources that you've used that have been useful in the past?
There is, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. There's a great one. There's 2 or 3 really good books around storytelling, and one of them is written by somebody whose background is in our industry. And I like the book, but I've forgotten the name. So we'll pop those on the website. I would say definitely looking at TED videos. Those are normally 10 minutes long, and the good ones adopt a storytelling approach. They have a beginning and a middle and an end, and they make sense, and they get the message across, and they do it really quickly. And so I would encourage people to look at those. I'm a big fan, in terms of straightforward techniques, of a guy called Gar Reynolds, who has a blog and some books called Presentation Zen. And that gets you to the next level. But one of the things I would say is pretty much avoid anything more than about 10 years old, because the style that audiences want changes over the years. So it's kind of linked to what TV looks like. And if you look at TV documentaries and TV news shows from 30 years ago and 20 years ago, they are so different to the way they happen now. And we need to recognize that there is a change in audiences' attention span, in their hunger for information versus entertainment, and we need to go with that process.
Right, again, good sound advice, Ray. Thank you. We have a few questions now. So this one from Lind Bacon, who says, "Great stuff, Ray. How would you approach doing a project for a client that insists that the work be CYA research?"
Well, I would have increased the price if I had to be cover your ass type research, because I'm not very good at that. There is obviously good work to do. A lot of it is in the design, so it's not so much in the storytelling and the presenting, but you are going to design the research so that if it's possible to CYA, it will do. If it's not possible, then we're really, as objective users of information, more objective than the client, that is, we still would not be able to do that. It's really, I suppose there is a whole bunch of research. I'll just expand it slightly from Lynn's point. There is some research which is done which is never going to be used. It's in there because the quality procedures say that at this gate you do this research, at this gate you do this research. And I think if you do that, then that is what you buy, that is what you sell, and you are not trying to find the do, you are just going through the exercise for money. And there are other occupations that people do just for the money, and you take your pick, really.
Right, okay. And I've learned something new there about what CYA stands for. Um, the second question here from Corey Manray. So, can you please define how to use think, feel, do across the typical deliverables? So, for example, exec presentations, full reports, summary, infographics, for follow-up review and proof audiences, early top-line reports, another example there. So, any advice there for Corey?
Yeah, so the early top line is just think in most cases, because you don't know what the do is going to be from that information. And if you have too much feel, then you're going to find it really hard to change it. So you start to look at the data, and I don't know if you were listening out there to the results coming in the Alabama special election. And initially, the data was looking very favorable for Moore. They were looking at the targets. He was hitting some of the targets, not the other targets, but he was ahead. And if we had put any emotion in the reporting, the people who had been doing that, then we'd have found out that we had the wrong result and we'd have felt cheated, because in the end Jones won. So top line reports are a place where think is the predominant thing. You're trying to avoid any emotional characteristics being picked up from that data. We simply want to provide some information. Before you get to the executive summary is about achieving do. It's probably about achieving a little bit of CYA too, because it's got to cover off some bases, but it's going to achieve the do. So what is it that I want people to do? If the only thing they read is the executive summary, then this is how we're going to get there. I've got the facts, and then I'm going to use them in an emotional way. So we're going to put them together in different ways that convey that. Now, that means that we are not going to tell those facts in the order that we collected them. We're not going to tell them in the order they are on the questionnaire. We are going to convey them in a way that works emotionally, and we are going to leave out of the executive summary anything that's irrelevant to the executive summary. It's going to be in the appendix or the background report. So make sure that you've not got too much in the executive summary, and think about putting a picture. Now, a picture could be an infographic in the executive summary, because if there is one page of a report that is often all text, it's actually the executive summary, because, oh my God, we've got to fit it on one page. So let's go for 10 point and long sentences. No, the reason why you've been asked to produce an executive summary is it's supposed to be really small. So think about using an image, think about using a cartoon, think about using a chart or an infographic on that page. I don't know if he's on the line at the moment. I think he might be. Mike Sherman has done a great presentation for us, which you can find in the archives, which really talks about pulling that structure together in terms of an executive summary. The executive summary has 3 points. Each point has 3 pieces of evidence, and everything else then goes into the appendix. And that is a really nice structure to use. And so if you're looking for a structure, if you do search on the NewMR website for Mike Sherman, it's one of the presentations he's done for us. It's a really useful presentation.
Yeah, echo that about Mike Sherman's presentation, Ray. Now we've got just 2 more questions. Now we had another question coming from Twitter. So this one is from Susan Pettigan, and Susan, apologies if I've not pronounced your surname correctly, who asks, what are some recommendations for influencing senior management of a client in a hard tier change, and in brackets traditional there, industry, as an agency who's been invited to post research? Changing their behaviour is the goal, of course.
You have to believe, first of all, you've got to believe that it's right. It's really hard to convey emotional messages if you don't start by believing this is right. But then it's about having those conversations, spending as much time as possible talking to people that know what does success look like. So where have they seen something go right? Ask them to describe, oh, we love the way that P&G turned itself around when AJ Lafley became the head, or love the way that Toyota are doing this, or we think that the innovations that are going on in this company are what. So get an understanding of what evidence they trust, what metaphors they believe in. Listen to the way they talk to each other to find out what are the sorts of terms and phrases, because you need to do things in their language when you talk to them, and even the little things. So back in the days when we used to have overhead projectors, different companies had different names for what the paper you wrote on, the transparent. Some would call them foils, some would call them slinkies. You need to make sure that when you're talking to people, you're using their language so they're not reprocessing anything you're saying. It actually fits into the pattern. So if they are a company that's obsessed with pyramids or inverted pyramids, that's what you should be using, because you're not trying to change everything about their life. You're trying to change one thing, which is the topic that is under investigation that you're reporting on. I want to change this behavior. So don't try to change too many things. You're trying to use everything else you know about them to leverage this single change.
Thank you, Ray. Now, this final question is coming to us from a regular listener on Twitter, who is asking if there are a couple of recommendations you've got for exercises specifically to help with this idea of robust simplification and leaving out bits of a story.
One of the things you can do as an exercise is you could write them down on your simplifications on a card, and then play rather like the game of Whispers, where each person has to rewrite the idea on the next card. So get 4 to 5 people in the office. You write down the first one. They've got to rewrite it in their own words. Next one has to rewrite it in their own words. And then have a look at the last card and see whether or not it's still the same message. Because if it's still the same message, that's robust simplification. But if it has changed, if it's gone from some women voted for this candidate to all women voted for this candidate, and so we might have started off with 10% of women voted for this candidate. The next person may have put some women voted for blogs. Next person might have put women voted for the winner. Now we've gone from 10%, which means 90% did not do it, to women did it, and that means all or most. So that would be a bad case of simplification. So I think playing the Whispers game, where people have to write it down and pass it on, and I'm sure that in these digital days we could do it without having to write it on pieces of paper, might be quite an interesting way at exploring that robust simplification.
Ray, thank you very much. These are all the questions that we've had so far. And thank you very much. And I know that, Ray, you've probably got some closing notes now.
Yes, thank you, Betty. So with that, thank you very much, and see you next year.